Previously, on Free Return Trajectory, CNSA felt that it was now safe to lower the orbit of Tianwen-1. The scientific community decided that it was safe to get Curiosity back on the path towards Aeolus Mons, but in less than 3 weeks, that plan had to be changed. There was an area of low-density material about a meter below the surface. Curiosity went into standby to wait out the storm. NASA was having trouble detecting any signals from Curiosity. Curiosity is now at least 2.5 meters below the surface. Aeolus Mount is no longer a destination. While the cavern that Curiosity is in is natural, it seems that something the size of the tunnel streaked through here relatively recent. Sample number 625. It was in this sample that we first detected vesicles that contain complex molecules. Before sample 625, we were detecting things like tyrosine, glycine, and other simple amino acids in the vesicles. But then, in 625, we came across a few of these amino acids that bonded together to form polypeptides. Now, I'm not a biochemist, so I can't speculate about the chemical pathway that led to the synthesis of these molecules. That's something Dr. Ordonez, our astrobiologist, would know. But what I do know is that the complexity varied based on where the samples were found on the probe. They also varied based on how deep the probe was. We know that probe 2 came to rest at 23 kilometers after the temporary power failure. Interestingly, the sample acquisition arm of the probe had the samples with the most complex molecules. Specifically, the part that extended into the lipid layer had extremely complex molecules in these vesicles. We've identified at least 60 types. And now for the part that's getting everyone excited. When we take these vesicles and put them together in the exact same solution and condition as the ocean, they always quickly merge into the same 4 unique types of extremely complex molecules trapped inside of individual vesicles. But this doesn't seem to be the case when they're in the ocean. Something must be replenishing the less complex molecules that are lost when they're merged, while at the same time removing the extremely complex ones. To be sure, we sent another probe to the lipid layer. The results were the same. The part of the probe that extended into the lipid layer had higher complexity vesicles that merged into the same 4 in our lab. Some highly active unknown process is producing these complex molecules. We are convinced that this process has a source. Our probes can't go much deeper than 1 kilometer or 2 below the lipid layer trying to track down a source. But what we can do is move horizontally and look for changes in the concentration and diversity of these molecules. This may help pinpoint the source. We're sending 3 probes to survey a 10-kilometer radius area. It's going to take some time. Until we get the data back, we will continue our story on how we rapidly colonize the solar system. Oh, one last thing. Whatever the source may be for these complex molecules, it's going to be at the very edge where a chemical process becomes a biological one. They say you can hear better with your eyes closed. Without visual distractions, you can concentrate on minute vibrations of the air and even the ground around you. You can build a visual representation of your surroundings without seeing it. So, if you ever find yourself in an environment with little or no lights, the same principle could be applied while your eyes are open. This analogy was presented by a scientist on the Curiosity Recovery Board that was discussing what to do with Curiosity. Curiosity fell through a skylight a few sols ago and is now trapped inside a tunnel at about 3 meters below the surface. The tunnel appeared to have recently been created by an unknown process. Composition of the tunnel was as expected, normal basalt rock. But at this time, NASA wasn't really that interested in the science. NASA was more interested in the safety of Curiosity. Did it sustain serious damage from the fall? This question was answered by running mobility tests and doing the most basic instrument checks. The results showed that Curiosity suffered almost no damage during the fall. There was some additional damage to the wheels, but nothing that prevented the rover from moving. The wheels now use up more energy due to more friction and slippage. This translates to less distance per battery charge than before. But in almost total darkness and no selected target, there was no need to get somewhere quickly. With mobility more or less working fine, the next important question was about the stability of the tunnel itself. How stable is it? Will more of the skylight collapse? This was one reason why NASA was eager to move the rover out of the immediate area. But then, the question became, what lies beyond the cone of its LED light? The LED light was not designed to be used as a searchlight, so it only reaches a few meters into the darkness. And this is why the scientists earlier presented that analogy to the Curiosity Recovery Board. Instead of relying on sight from the camera, maybe Curiosity can rely on the microphones to detect sounds in the environment. By analyzing these sounds, it could potentially reconstruct some elements of its immediate surroundings. A rover engineer had to remind the scientists that Perseverance was the rover with the microphone, not Curiosity. Not taking no for an answer, and to some extent, trying to recover from an embarrassing suggestion, the scientist then suggested a way of listening to sound, or actually strong vibrations, using the gyroscope and accelerometer housed in the Rover Inertia Measuring Unit, or RIMU, inside of Curiosity. These are very sensitive instruments. They were once used to measure the gravitational pull of the mountain that Curiosity is next to, Aeolus Mons. So there was some confidence that if Curiosity was in an environment that had very loud sounds, or some level of vibration, it could be detected. The detection scheme worked, and 2 periodic vibrations were detected. Since these vibrations were at different frequencies, they moved through the ground at different speeds, and based on this, after moving the rover a few meters, it could be determined if it was moving towards or away from the source of the vibration. The source turned out to be down the tunnel, beyond the lights of Curiosity, about 50 meters away. Just 50 meters. Suddenly, there was this realization among members of the Curiosity Recovery Board that they may be only days, or actually sols, away from uncovering the biggest mystery in Mars exploration. That is, what happened to the missing impact crater on Aeolus Mons? What happened to the suspected meteorite from comet P2019 LD2? But then, another realization dawned. The 50 meters that needs to be traveled will be completely inside the tunnel, far away from the skylight opening. That means Curiosity would not be able to send or receive data from the Tianwen-1 orbiter. Basically, Curiosity can't venture deeper into the tunnel unless there was a way to maintain communication with the rover deep inside the tunnel. But being so close to making the discovery that could dramatically change our understanding of Mars, and then giving up, was something NASA, CNSA, and ESA were not willing to do. So, it didn't take long for the thinking out of the box to start. One suggestion was to allow Curiosity to perform an autonomous drive for 50 meters, gather data and images, and then return to the skylight and re-establish contact with Tianwen-1. This would make the autonomous drive a total of 100 meters. Of course, this assumes that there is a straight path to the source of the vibration. This tunnel may not even lead to the vibration source. Even if this is a direct path, this 100 meters would be the longest drive that Curiosity has performed, and that was in daylight. Daylight is important because the nav cams and HAZ cams used for navigation and hazard avoidance require lots of light to function properly. That amount of light is something that the LED light on Curiosity cannot provide, so an autonomous drive into the tunnel is simply not possible. Considering that the autonomous drive relies on the nav cam detecting land features for navigation in the distance, when in low light, only pronounced features will stand out, and in this tunnel, there aren't any. However, if these features could be made by Curiosity, then they could be used as some sort of a guidepost to navigate back to the skylight. These features would be made by Curiosity periodically drilling a hole in the rocky ground every 5 meters. NavCam would then use them as navigation markers. While this idea could work, it's very slow, since frequent return to the skylight is needed as the rover searches for the source of the vibration. In addition, there is still a risk of the rover getting stuck while it's out of communication. In situations like that, there would be no way to diagnose and potentially fix the problem. It would be an end-of-mission event. The brainstorming session to find a way to the source of the vibration ended in a failure. A big disappointment. So close, but yet so far. The presentation screen was turned off and the participants left except for 2 scientists. One went into the break room and brought back 2 ice-filled glasses of iced coffee. Looking at the glass, the other scientist said, "What if the vibration that Curiosity is detecting is coming from the sublimation of large amounts of underground ice triggered by exposure to the low-pressure Martian atmosphere when the skylight was created? That would not be a groundbreaking discovery at all, would it? Maybe this is not a big deal." The first scientist then slowly said, "Groundbreaking ice," and then shouted, "This is a big deal." He then went on to explain that Tianwen-1, just like Mars Express, has a ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, that's used to detect subsurface structures like underground ice. If the transmitter and receiver on Curiosity could be reprogrammed to detect the GPR signal and transmit data that mimics GPR reflections, maybe, just maybe, some communication can be established between Curiosity and Tianwen-1, even when far away from the skylight. With some tweaks to the transmitter and receiver of the GPR on Tianwen-1, it may be possible to recover some data transmitted by Curiosity, albeit at an extremely low data rate. The 2 scientists were able to convince the Curiosity Recovery Board that this was the fastest and safest way to investigate the ground vibration. And so, the implementation of these changes were initiated. For the first time, Curiosity was out of normal contact with Earth. The GPR communication scheme proved to be reliable, albeit at an extremely slow data rate, as low as 40 bits per second. Not only that, the code that ran the robotic arm had to be temporarily deleted to make room for the GPR decoding and transmission software. The robotic arm software module was the only module that Curiosity could afford to erase while in the tunnel. Similar software replacement operation was done when Curiosity first landed on Mars, and the flight software was written over with the surface operation software. Curiosity traveled into the tunnel at a rate of about 5 meters a sol. At that rate, The estimated time to reach the source of the vibration was about 10 sols. For the first 7 sols, Curiosity traveled more or less in a straight line. The tunnel became wider until it turned into a cavern. The temperature steadily increased, and at the end of the 7th sol, it was about 10 degrees Celsius. At this point, there was no doubt in the minds of the scientists on the Curiosity Recovery Board that the source of the heat was related to the vibrations. By the 9th sol, the cavern narrowed back into a tunnel and made a 90-degree turn. The vibration was now coming directly from in front of the rover at only 5 meters. With the LED light pointed straight ahead along with the mass cam and nav cam on Curiosity, only blackness appeared in the initial images. Since the rover was so close to the source, it appeared that the source of the vibration was just below the floor of the tunnel. That was very disappointing because it meant that the source of the vibration would never be captured on camera. And maybe the scientist that said the discovery was not going to be groundbreaking at all was, in the end, correct. To make matters worse, over time, the images that Curiosity was returning became noisier with random white dots appearing in them. The end result was similar to the photo of the so-called face on Mars, a noisy image that made an ordinary boulder on Mars look like a human face. But in these images, there were only white dots on a black background. In an attempt to minimize the noise in the images, Curiosity was set to back away by about a meter and see if the noise would be reduced. Maybe the noise was generated by the source of the vibration. But before backing away, the nav cam on Curiosity was turned 180 degrees in 20 degrees increments. At the end of each increment, a picture would be taken. This enabled Curiosity to get a semi-panoramic view of its surroundings while the camera was being positioned to look behind the rover and prepare a navigational route before moving it. When the set of images were analyzed by the Curiosity Recovery Board, they discovered something very subtle, but with a game-changing implication. As the camera panned around, the area of the noisy white dots appeared to be cropped more and more until they disappeared. This is not the way noise would affect an image. After the camera was commanded to make a 270-degree turn, that is the limit of how far it can turn, it was clear that the noisy area was being cropped horizontally and then fully disappeared. The scientists then realized that the noisy white dots actually physically existed in front of the rover and in fact were not noise at all. There was something. But what? Curiosity was then instructed to approach the slowly moving white dots. As the rover approached the dots, it became clear that these dots were moving because they were actually floating on a liquid surface. This liquid extended into the cavern entrance, which was about a meter beyond the epicenter of the vibration. Curiosity appeared to have found an underground pond or even a lake on Mars. And from the movements of the floating dots, the liquid appeared to closely match the viscosity of water. Curiosity has just stumbled on the biggest discovery ever made on Mars. If that liquid is in fact water, it would dramatically speed up the human colonization of Mars. The cavern would be the very core for the first human habitat on Mars. 10 degrees Celsius, liquid water, and 10% oxygen in the air. This is almost a livable environment for humans. There was excitement at NASA, CNSA, and ESA, but also caution. The liquid has not been tested yet and could be something totally different than water. The space agencies decided to not make a public announcement until all of the minimum amount of data about the cavern and the lake was collected. But as expected, news of the underground lake was still made public because the raw data itself from Curiosity was publicly available. When the news media first broadcasted the underground lake story, few people in the general public took notice. but it was a group of scientists from an organization called Viking Group that had been analyzing all of the anomalies on Mars since the mysterious 8 boulders fell from the Martian sky and then fell into a fissure that opened up in the ground. Now, to be clear, these scientists were considered by their peers to be fringe scientists. They've been trying to find a connection between Mars and nearby star systems since the first exoplanet around a sun-like star was discovered in 1995. With the latest discovery of the underground lake, these scientists were now more than ever determined to find that link between Mars and nearby exoplanets. They were now waiting for NASA to publish the data on the liquid in the underground lake. They believed that the data from the liquid in the lake, which they assumed to be water, will have the same ratio of hydrogen and oxygen isotopes as the water vapor detected in the atmosphere in a particular exoplanet. That exoplanet was K2-18b, a suspected ocean world. But after waiting on NASA for 2 weeks for the data on the liquid from the lake, they felt that something was not right. They felt like NASA was intentionally withholding the information about the liquid. In reality, there was no withholding or conspiracy. In order for NASA to use the robotic arm to get samples from the lake, the robotic arm software had to be re-downloaded from Earth because it was deleted earlier to make room for the GPR communication code. But before that can be done, Curiosity had to navigate to the exact location where the arm can be extended into the lake without the wheels of Curiosity getting too close to the liquid. This was important because once in position, the mobility software that controlled the movement of the rover would be overwritten by the downloaded robotic arm software because of limited storage space once again. The entire process would take a month because of the very slow data rate of the ad hoc GPR communication. And that was the cause of the ongoing delay. The Viking Group did not believe in this explanation for the delay of the data. They were now convinced more than ever that the withholding from NASA was due to the fact that after a secret sampling, the isotopes of the liquid from the lake matched exactly with those from the water vapor in the atmosphere of the exoplanet K2-18b. They believed that NASA had discovered a body of water on Mars that originated from another star system and was keeping that information a secret because that implied somebody, something brought that water to Mars from that star system. As the weeks went by and there was no data or official word from NASA about the lake, more people started believing in the secrecy narrative that the Viking Group was promoting. But in reality, scientists and engineers from the Curiosity Recovery Board were getting Curiosity ready for the next phase of the mission. It was not about recovery anymore. It was about discovery.